What if I told you that in certain villages, your husband dying didn't just mean grief, inheritance paperwork, and awkward condolences? It meant the whole community was about to drag you into a ritual that looked more like an orgy than a funeral. Yeah. Welcome to one of history's darkest rabbit holes, where mourning wasn't private and your body wasn't your own. If you thought widow's weeds meant wearing black, in these places it meant being paraded, stripped, and shoved into rituals that blurred the line between religion and raw exploitation. And the best part? Historians didn't exactly hide this stuff. They just wrapped it up in academic terms like fertility rites and communal cleansing, because apparently saying, "The village made the widow sleep with strangers in public," was a little too real for textbooks. So buckle up, because once you hear what went down, you'll never complain about an awkward family funeral again. Oh, and if you enjoy history that makes you wonder whether therapy should be mandatory in schools, subscribe. You'll need the sessions. Let's get right into it. Number 1. The widow as a community property. Imagine this. Your husband's funeral ends, the priest mumbles some prayers, and then, bam, the focus shifts to you. Not your grief, not your future, not your inheritance. No. The villagers start chanting because you, the freshly minted widow, are now polluted. And guess how they fix that? By making you clean through sex, lots of it, with multiple men, in public. This wasn't some naughty underground cult either. In certain African and South Asian communities, and yes, even whispers in old European villages, widows were literally forced to take part in what anthropologists politely call ritual intercourse. The idea was that death released dangerous spiritual energy, and unless that widow was purified, the crops would fail, cows would die, and everyone's life would basically go to hell. So, to save the wheat harvest, you had to sacrifice your dignity. Picture standing there with the entire village watching, pressured into sleeping with someone, sometimes a relative, sometimes a designated ritual cleanser, sometimes literally whoever stepped forward first. Privacy? Zero. Consent? Don't even ask. And the cherry on top? People defended this by saying, well, it's for the community's survival. Basically, your body was like a rental car that had to be reset before being returned to circulation. Nice, right? Nothing says sorry for your loss like being forced into a group sex ritual in front of your neighbors. Number 2. When funerals became fertility festivals, here's where things get even weirder. You might think a funeral is supposed to be sad, people crying, a few bad hymns, casseroles waiting back home. But in villages that practiced these widow orgy rituals, funerals doubled as fertility festivals. Death was seen as bad vibes, but sex? Sex was like miracle grow for the universe. So the logic went like this. Husband dead equals cosmic imbalance. Widow plus ritual sex equals cosmic balance restored. Sometimes the widow was expected to sleep with a priest or shaman, because apparently nothing solves grief like being mounted by the holy man. Other times, it was with multiple men, each one charging her with enough life force to keep the seasons turning. If this sounds like a horror show disguised as a party, that's because it was. And don't forget the audience, neighbors, relatives, the old guy from down the street, everyone gathered to watch. Imagine your most traumatic moment turned into a public spectacle, except nobody brought tissues, just torches and drums. Anthropologists note that these rituals weren't treated as dirty or shameful. They were celebrated as if the widow's pain was some kind of cosmic entertainment. Think community theater, except the only role you got was sex offering. The brutal irony? Widows who refused were often ostracized, beaten, or even accused of witchcraft. Because, of course, nothing screams evil witch like saying, "Please, I'd rather not sleep with 5 random dudes at my husband's funeral." Number 3. Cleansing by the stranger. Okay, so let's say your husband dies, and you're trying to keep a low profile. Maybe you're thinking, if I just sit quietly, they'll leave me alone. Wrong. In many villages, the widow wasn't even allowed to pick who purified her. Enter the stranger cleanser. Yes, sometimes a total outsider was summoned, basically a traveling sex exorcist, whose only job was to sleep with widows so their death curse didn't spread. Imagine a dude rolling into town, everyone nodding like, "Ah, yes, the sacred gigolo has arrived." The widow didn't get a say in it, because remember, her body was considered contaminated. She wasn't a person anymore, just a vessel that needed rebooting. The reasoning? Locals believed that if someone from within the village did the cleansing, they'd absorb the widow's bad luck and drag the whole community down. So they drafted outsiders, sometimes men with reputations as wanderers or worse, men considered spiritually dirty themselves, because hey, if you're already a mess, why not take on more bad juju? Now picture it. Your grief, your body, your future, all decided by a ritual that paired you with a man you'd never met, while your in-laws cheered it on. This wasn't about healing, it was about control. And in some twisted way, it was also about entertainment, because villagers often watched. That's right, your most intimate violation doubled as Saturday night's show. Basically, it was a Netflix and chill, except Netflix was the village drumbeat, and chill meant absolutely nothing. Number 4. The widow banished to the hut. Here's the thing. Not all widow rituals involved instant orgies. Sometimes the humiliation came first. In certain cultures, a widow was forced into isolation in a tiny hut at the edge of the village. Sounds peaceful? Think again. She wasn't just mourning, she was treated like radioactive waste. For weeks, or even months, she couldn't touch food, water, or tools without someone else cleansing them first. Villagers avoided eye contact. And here's the kicker. When the time finally came to reintegrate her, the welcoming back ceremony often involved, you guessed it, public sex. So after starving in a hut, lonely, grieving, and filthy, the widow was dragged out and told she could be part of society again, but only if she shared herself with one or several men in front of everyone. It was like hazing, but the frat was your entire village, and the ritual wasn't a prank. It was your new life. The psychological cruelty of this setup is hard to overstate. First, they convinced her she was toxic, then they demanded she prove her purity through degradation. It's like a medieval scam subscription service. First you pay in shame, then you pay again in trauma. And if she resisted, forget social life. She'd be labeled a danger to the harvest, or worse, someone who invited spirits to punish the entire community. Nothing like being told, sleep with strangers or we'll blame you if the corn dies. Number 5, widowhood as public theater. Now imagine this. The widow's cleansing isn't done quietly behind a curtain. Nope. In many of these traditions, it was staged like theater. The funeral rite didn't end when the husband was buried. Oh no. The second act was the widow's body being paraded like the headline show. Villagers gathered, music played, and the widow was pushed into performing her role in front of everyone. Sometimes she was stripped, sometimes decorated with ashes or oils, and sometimes even forced to dance before being purified. It was humiliation, wrapped in pageantry, like a grotesque carnival where grief was just a backdrop for voyeurism. Why? Because public spectacle reinforced control. Everyone saw it, everyone believed it, and nobody dared question it, because if the widow resisted, she wasn't just defying her family. She was defying the gods, the ancestors, and basically the entire cosmic order. In short, her trauma was the community's entertainment and its scapegoat all at once. Imagine trying to cry at your husband's grave while your neighbors are chanting for you to undress and get on with the ritual. That's less mourning and more performance art from hell. And historians will casually write, the community reinforced cohesion through public widow rites. Translation, they turned human suffering into dinner theater. Number 6, orgy as exorcism. Death was scary, spirits were scary, and apparently the best way to beat them was an orgy. Whole villages believed that if one man cleansing the widow was good, then multiple men in rapid succession was even better. The logic? Each act chipped away at the death energy clinging to her body until she was fully scrubbed clean. So, some funerals ended not with quiet prayers, but with group sex, performed as though it was exorcism. Think of it like spraying down a haunted house with holy water, except the house was a grieving woman's body. And the holy water was, well, you get the picture. And this wasn't whispered shame, it was institutionalized. The village expected it. In fact, widows who didn't go through it were often accused of bringing plagues, bad harvests, or even random accidents. Basically, every misfortune suddenly traced back to, she didn't do the ritual. Can you imagine the pressure? You're standing there, broken by loss, and you're told, if you don't let the entire village use you, your children will starve. That's not purification. That's extortion with a side of spiritual blackmail. But hey, at least the community slept easy afterwards, convinced they'd scared off the ghosts. Who needs garlic or sage when you've got widow trauma as exorcism? Number 7. When refusal meant witchcraft. So what happened if a widow said, no thanks, I'll just keep my dignity and skip the ritual sex? Easy answer. She was branded a witch, because clearly, grief-stricken women were just one broomstick away from summoning Satan, right? Communities were terrified of death's contamination, and refusing the ritual basically painted a neon target on your back. Villagers whispered, she's cursed. She's hiding bad spirits. Suddenly, every broken plow, every dead goat, every case of food poisoning, guess whose fault it was? The widow who refused to have sex in public. Accusations escalated fast. Some widows were beaten until they agreed, others were driven out of their homes, and some were straight up executed. That's how high the stakes were. Say no to ritualized gang humiliation, and you might not live long enough to regret it. The cruelty here wasn't just physical, it was psychological warfare. Communities held their food, their affection, and even their protection hostage unless the widow gave in. And once she did, guess what? She wasn't pure forever. If another husband died later, yep, she had to do it all over again. Widowhood wasn't a tragedy. It was a recurring nightmare subscription service you could never cancel. Basically, your grief was less about loss and more about fighting for survival against your own neighbors. Talk about dying of heartbreak, literally. Number 8. The family's role in the exploitation. Now you'd think, at the very least, your in-laws might defend you. Wrong again. In many villages, the husband's family was the loudest cheerleader for the ritual. Why? Because keeping you pure wasn't about your feelings. It was about their property and honor. See, if you skipped the ritual, people might say the family was cursed. That could affect their land, their marriages, even their standing in the community. So to protect their reputation, they happily shoved you onto the ritual stage. Some families even arranged the first purifier, sometimes a cousin, sometimes a hired outsider. Imagine your mother-in-law negotiating who gets first dibs. Awkward doesn't even cover it. And if you resisted, they might disown you. Or worse, accuse you of trying to bring shame onto their bloodline. Because in the twisted logic of these traditions, you weren't a human being. You were basically an extension of your husband's corpse. His spirit polluted you, so his family got to dictate how you were fixed. So yeah, forget about sympathy casseroles or stay as long as you need. Instead, you got a crowd of relatives yelling at you to strip for the gods. Family reunions, now with extra trauma. Number 9. Widow inheritance, but with perks for men. In some cultures, instead of a public orgy, the ritual was framed as inheritance. Sounds practical, right? Keep the widow in the family so she doesn't starve. Except, plot twist, it wasn't about her well-being. It was about ensuring her body stayed useful to her late husband's lineage. Often, the brother of the deceased was first in line. The widow was gifted to him, like passing down a sword or a piece of land. Did she get a choice? No. She was told that if she didn't submit, her dead husband's spirit would haunt the family, the crops, and possibly her children. Nothing like a little supernatural guilt-tripping to spice up forced remarriage. Now, this wasn't exactly romantic. The transfer of the widow was often sealed by a public sex act in front of witnesses so that everyone knew the curse was lifted. Yep, consummation as a community event. Try explaining that to your grandkids. Yeah, sweetie, Grandma's wedding night happened next to the goat pen while the whole village watched. And if the brother didn't want her, she could be passed around until someone did. Widows became property in the most literal sense, auctioned off under the guise of spiritual duty. Basically, widow inheritance was just Tinder for in-laws, except you couldn't swipe left. Number 10. Ritual as entertainment. Here's the darkest kicker. For many villagers, these rituals weren't just serious religious duties. They were also fun. They were drama, scandal, and spectacle rolled into one. People dressed up, sang, and danced while the widow was forced into the spotlight. It was grief rebranded as community entertainment. Imagine your neighbor's husband dies. Instead of sending flowers, you gather with popcorn to watch her be humiliated in front of everyone. Kids ran around, old folks gossiped, and the young men bragged about who got chosen for the ritual. It was less about purifying spirits and more about validating masculinity and keeping everyone too scared to break the rules. And the widow? She wasn't just the main act, she was the sacrificial clown. Her pain reinforced social order. If she complied, everyone cheered because the balance was restored. If she resisted, they booed, mocked, and punished her until she gave in. Either way, the village got a show. In a way, these rituals were like ancient reality TV, except instead of signing up for humiliation, you were forced into it when your husband croaked. The message was clear. Your body wasn't yours. It was the stage where everyone else worked out their fears, their lust, and their superstitions. Number 11. From cleansing to commerce. As if public sex rituals weren't dehumanizing enough, some villages turned widow cleansing into straight-up business. Men were paid in food, livestock, or even coins to perform the duty. Basically, ritual prostitution, but sanctified. And who footed the bill? The widow's family. Imagine being told, not only do you have to endure this degrading ceremony, but also, please pay the guy who's violating you. If the family couldn't afford it, the widow herself was forced to repay through labor, servitude, or, you guessed it, more sexual exploitation. This wasn't just about superstition, it was an economic system. Entire networks of cleansers traveled between villages, making a living off women's grief. It turned death into a payday and the widow's body into the community ATM. The irony? Outsiders sometimes described these practices as tradition-preserving order, when really it was exploitation wrapped in ritual. Strip away the religious excuses, and what you're left with is systemic abuse that profited off trauma. Basically, capitalism, but with drums and chants. Number 12. The ghost husband. Excuse? If you thought all of this was bad, wait for this bit of gaslighting. Some cultures told widows that if they didn't go through the ritual, their dead husband's spirits would return at night to claim their rights. In other words, if you don't sleep with strangers in public, your ghost husband will come, and do it anyway. That's right. They scared women with the idea of spectral marital rape. Talk about a lose-lose situation. Either you submit to living men in front of everyone, or you get haunted by the horny undead. And of course, if the widow had nightmares or broke down emotionally, villagers took it as proof. The ghost was punishing her for refusing. So, not only were widows coerced physically, but they were terrorized psychologically. Their grief was twisted into supernatural blackmail, convincing them they had no way out. Think about it. You've just lost the love of your life, and instead of comfort, you're told, oh, by the way, he'll crawl out of the grave and assault you unless you strip for the community this weekend. Hallmark did not make a card for that. Number 13. Trauma disguised as tradition. When you zoom out, all of these widow rituals boil down to one thing: weaponized tradition. Communities wrapped their fears, insecurities, and greed in sacred language, then dumped the cost onto the most vulnerable women. The widow became a scapegoat, a body to absorb everyone else's anxieties about death and survival. And sure, some anthropologists will drone on about symbolic rebirth or communal purification, but let's call it what it was: trauma. Women who went through these ordeals weren't being cleansed. They were being broken. Their grief was hijacked, their bodies commodified, and their suffering normalized as the way things are. The scariest part? Many widows internalized it. If the entire community tells you that refusing means curses and ghosts, eventually you stop questioning. You accept humiliation as survival. And that's the cruel genius of these practices. They turned oppression into ritual, and ritual into law. So the next time someone romanticizes ancient traditions, remember, sometimes those traditions were just systematic abuse with better marketing. If history teaches us anything, it's that power doesn't always need swords or crowns. Sometimes it hides in the rules everyone follows without thinking. Communities convinced widows that public orgies were holy, when really it was about control, fear, and keeping women from ever feeling safe in their own skin. And before you say, well, thank God we're past that, think again. Modern societies still shame women for grieving too long, still regulate their bodies, and still dress control up as a tradition or law. The costumes are different, but the performance hasn't ended. So maybe the real takeaway is this: history isn't just in books, it's in the way we treat people today. And if your community ever suggests a cleansing ritual at a funeral, maybe run. That's all for today. I'll be making similar videos in the future. Subscribe to see them.